Hello and welcome to The Energy Gang, a discussion show about the fast-changing world of energy. I'm Ed Crooks. New York Climate Week wrapped last week, and this is the last in a series of special episodes of The Energy Gang, bringing you the highlights from a packed week of discussions, events and initiatives across the city. During the event, I sat down with Jeffrey Pyatt, who is the US Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, to talk about the key issues he's working on in terms of climate and energy security. But before that, I spoke to Helen Clarkson, who's the Chief Executive of the Climate Group, which puts on Climate Week every year. She was recently named as one of the top 100 most important people in global climate. Helen, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Particularly, thank you for joining us on what is clearly an incredibly busy week for you. We're now at Thursday. It's winding down, but still a lot going on even now. How are you feeling?
Absolutely exhausted, but really thrilled. It's really sort of caught fire this year, I think. We've been doing it for 16 years. It was pretty big. It's been pretty big since the pandemic, I'd say. But this year, it's really gone to another level, I think partly because there's a lot of worry is probably the wrong word, but a lot of people are sort of opting out of the Baku COP for various reasons. And so it's a sort of we sort of position this now as a very natural place to come and meet. And so we know people have got it on their agenda, they've been coming. And so the sort of parties that would normally go to Baku are all here. And then the kind of civil society piece is also caught on. And those two things sort of feed off each other.
I think I read that there was something like 600 separate events.
900. So
900.
600
wow.
Last year. So we were using 600 in our in our kind of pre-event where you're sort of guessing. And then it went up to 900, which is pretty amazing. And then I read somewhere, not our numbers, but someone estimated there might be 100,000 people in New York this week doing something connected with Climate Week NYC. So, yes, we're definitely getting to the place I wanted to get to, which is people know when fashion weeks are happening, and I want them to know when Climate Week New York is happening.
As you're saying, you've been putting this event on for 16 years now. How has it changed over that time? Yeah,
so I think when it started, and I wasn't at Climate Group then, I actually came as a participant some of the early years. It was probably much more directed at business. It was more the message, I think, and certainly kind of Climate Group started being an organisation that was about setting out the case for business action. So I think in those early years, Climate Week was that as well. It was about case making. You should be doing this. And moving it away from it being seen as a moral issue into a critical business issue. And with great foresight, my predecessors put it alongside the UN General Assembly. You know, you've got all these world leaders in town, a lot of people coming to New York anyway. And so they said, well, let's do it together and work with the UN a bit to show that it's happening. What's happened over the years and how it's evolved, and probably why it's so big now, is that as climate action has mainstreamed and as more and more organisations know they have to work on climate and targets are set and so on, people are coming to Climate Week NYC to find out how to do that. So I think the question has evolved. It's no longer why, it's now how. And we certainly put our programming around that. And we do still do a lot of the kind of showcasing. You know, we get some good speakers to come and, fire people up. I want people to leave feeling like they're part of a team that's working on climate. It can get quite lonely. So I want that feeling. And I think we get that with a lot of the events. But there's also a lot of closed door events or kind of networking events, but a lot of conversations happening. And I've heard people say that they find the roundtables and sort of the bilaterals that they can have because they know people are here to be some of the most useful stuff.
And through the week then, in terms of the conversations that you've been having and you've been talking to people and people have been talking to other people, as you say, all these conversations going on across New York this week, how would you describe the mood? Do you think people are, I guess...
The vibes.
The vibes, exactly. Very good point. Yeah, what are the vibes? And I suppose the specific reason I'm asking that is that it feels like maybe over the past couple of years, some of the momentum has been moving away from climate action. Other priorities have come up in the world of energy in particular in terms of energy security following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. People have been worried about energy prices because of that surge of global inflation we had after the pandemic and so on. And so, as I say, there's been, I think, quite a bit of questioning over whether the momentum towards decarbonisation is as strong now as it seemed, let's say, at COP26 in Glasgow. Is that
Yeah, it's
fair?
an interesting one because I think it's quite a mixed picture because we still see a lot of action from corporates. We're certainly not seeing companies go back on their ambition. We're not seeing governments really go back on their ambition. So some of it, I think, is the framing might have changed. So you might hear much more talk now about energy security, but people are still talking about renewables as a way to deliver that. You could also see prices coming down. And again, I think it's part of this normalising in a way of climate action. It doesn't all have to be branded as climate action. It's much more, how do we get the energy transition? How do we build the energy future we want? So I don't get a sense that people are, moving on to something else. I was worried in terms of like the vibes and the mood. I was very worried coming in about how is the US election going to play? Is that all we're going to hear about? Actually, Climate Week NYC is a very global event. And also linked to that point about are things slowing down. We do a lot of our work actually in Asia. And of course there you don't hear in Asia about ESG backlash at all. You hear about CBAM and how we're going to, deal with the carbon border adjustment. These are the realities of transition. And equally, US companies that we work with a lot of global companies, and they sort of say, look, it doesn't matter what happens in the election in one sense because there's still EU regulation we're going to have to comply with, and that's actually what's driving it. So some of this, I think, maybe it's being optimistic, but it is about, as climate action gets mainstreamed, you don't have to have so much kind of, putting a green label on it. It's about actually how do we prepare and deliver on the targets we've set.
So what have been the highlights for you of the week? What has struck you as most interesting, most important that's happened during this week?
Yeah, so we had our opening ceremony on Sunday. That's always one of the kind of, exciting moments to watch. We had the Prime Minister of the Bahamas came. People were really interested to hear from him. Very interested to hear. We had the first minister from Brazil, who's, the Indigenous Peoples Minister. People really, interested to hear from both of them as people who are on the kind of front line of climate impact. And Jacinda Ardern came along and did a kind of rallying cry. So those sort of moments I think are good, again, of sort of, getting people excited. At that, we also shared our global to-do list, we called it. So I think one of the other things that's changed for Climate Group over the years at Climate Week is the degree to which actually we push our own work and our own thinking. And I think a few years ago when I started, we were almost too busy running Climate Week to kind of effectively think, well, how do we push our own agenda? This year our theme is It's Time. We've really been pushing that story of urgency, asking people, look, what are the concrete actions you're going to take? And so we thought it was right for us to come up with our own list of actions that we will be talking about. So it's things like setting up a global agency on methane, banning the relining of blast furnaces, because if you have an old steel blast furnace now, if you reline it, effectively you're committing to coal for the next 15 years. So if you want to transition away, put that investment somewhere else. So we're getting quite specific, and we are trying to kind of show by doing that you've got to move away from this kind of it's all about 2030 and 2050, because you just can't set a 2050 target and think, right, I'll get right on that in 2048,
One of the themes that I've been picking up on, and I think some of this comes through in your to-do list that you've just been talking about, and I got this as well from your speech at the opening ceremony I went to on Sunday, is, as you say, that alignment of climate action and energy security, and looking at ways the two things can go hand in hand, and in particular this issue about clearing away obstacles to investment in renewable energy.
Yeah.
So kind of working out how to make it easier to build new low carbon energy capacity that can both cut emissions and strengthen energy security. Talk a little bit about that. What have you been doing on that front, and how much progress do you think you're making?
Yeah, so it's interesting. If you read IEA reports, for example, they'll say solar is the cheapest form of energy in history. Wind is incredibly cheap. So there isn't really a cost issue around this. When you dig then what the issues are, a lot of them are regulatory. So it's permits, it's siting, and so with our partners, we have a program called RE100, which is a corporate commitment to 100% renewable electricity globally. So we check in with them every year. How are you doing? Where are you meeting your targets? Where are you having problems? And within that, we can then look at them and ask them which are the hardest markets to buy renewable electricity in. And they are very consistent with their answers. South Korea and Japan always come top of the list. Then you have like South Africa, Argentina, places like that. So that then allows us as Climate Group to go and direct our policy work. And we did a report last November on the G20 and looked at 8 countries. And some of the regulations, like the ones that struck me in particular, South Korea has really, specific regulations saying you can't put solar in some districts within 100 meters or even a kilometer of residential dwellings. Well, if you look at how we've rolled solar out across Europe, massive success in Germany is by putting solar panels on houses. Now, that's a sort of regulation that if you can take that away, you've got all this pent-up demand from the likes of the RE100 companies. There are tens of them in South Korea waiting to go. And so a lot of our work is looking at how can we tackle those regulations, which might not be deeply political. I also had a conversation this week with one of the UK energy generators saying that, we hear a lot in the UK, for example, about NIMBYism and, wind and so on. But if you say to people, look, we'll put a wind turbine near you and you'll get, I think it was like 10, 20% off your energy bill. Oh, everyone wants the wind turbine then, right? So it's trying to think about how do we go through this transition and actually meet people where they are and understand what's driving some of the thoughts, what's behind those regulations. In South Korea, I can't help but think it's a kind of outdated regulation from some other generation of solar, for example, and finding that out is important.
And so are you just at the start of that effort then?
We've been doing a couple of years in South Korea and Japan. We've had some success. We've, for those countries, created policy asks that are specific. So we're trying to really move from that, global down to the specific market asks. Some of that wording has been taken into law in South Korea. So it's that sort of thing that we're trying to do. And we've just, we work through local partners. So we're a global organisation. But, how you do policy work in Japan versus South Korea, very different, and so you need a local partner who kind of knows the ways around, and we partner together. And so we're starting that. We've just had a team spend a few weeks in Indonesia to try and start working there.
And you've also launched this group working for 24/7 Clean Electricity, group of businesses.
Yeah.
Google, I think, is one of the leading members.
Yes, the founder partner. There's 6 partners have joined up. It's sort of the next generation. It's sort of saying, okay, how do you almost go beyond RE100 in a way? And RE100 is still incredibly ambitious, important commitment for companies. But a lot of companies trying to ask, well, how do you go carbon free 24 hours a day, which means in certain markets you're going to have to match your electricity with certificates down to the 15-minute level. That's a huge data thing. It's really, that is very much at the start, and it's a project where I really commend the companies for signing up to that because they really don't know how they're going to do it. And so we've set it out actually as a kind of stepped up commitment. You don't have to commit. RE100, you've got to commit globally from the go. This, you have to pick a market, you start there and take it forward. So it's really ambitious.
So to be clear what that difference is then, so if you're in RE100, you're saying we will match the entirety of our power consumption
annually. But within market, that's really important in markets. So, you can't match South Korea electricity with a certificate from Norway, right? Because then you could all just go to 100 straight away and actually the grids wouldn't look any different. So RE100 has very important technical criteria about what counts as a certificate. And the lack of certificates in places like South Korea where there's just enough renewable electricity, what drives the problem. But you are matching annually, and this will get down to the 15-minute increment eventually.
Right, as you say, so very demanding in fact then, and pushes you towards a lot of new technologies, I guess things like nuclear maybe, advanced nuclear, enhanced geothermal, long duration storage, all those kind of things.
All those sorts of things will come in.
Yeah.
And actually, we're at the start of the project now and setting out the technical criteria. And that's where it's exciting to have the first companies there because they will work on that with us, which can sound a bit odd, like are they setting their own rules? But it's not really like that. It's trying to really get into that kind of nitty gritty of, these are the first people really thinking about this. But yes, I expect battery storage in particular is going to be a huge part of that story in the years to come.
And the companies that are involved in that, so that's Google, AstraZeneca, who else?
Iron Mountain Data Centres, Shree Cement, Air Trunk, and Vodafone UK. So really good range of sectors as well.
But presumably then the objective would be to add more and more companies.
Yes, we will. I don't think it will get to, RE100 is 460, I think it is, members, some sort of number like that. I expect this will remain a smaller group for the time being, but we will add others in there. And we're also talking to others about, do you want to almost have observer status or something, just sort of explore it as it goes until they can make the commitment.
So let's look ahead to COP29 in Azerbaijan in November then. As you're saying, perhaps you're sort of a beneficiary at New York Climate Week in maybe expectations being played down a little bit for what's going to happen at COP29, partly possibly just for sort of logistical reasons, people not wanting to go there, but also because I think people are not generally expecting there to be any kind of dramatic breakthroughs. The big issue on the agenda is this new collective quantified goal for climate finance, and it's clear from what I hear anecdotally, those negotiations are difficult. Making progress on that is not easy. What are your expectations? What do you think we might get to see at COP29, and what would count as a good outcome, I guess?
I think, well, actually, I could almost just repeat what you've said back to you, because I think that's exactly what I'm hearing as well. Look, the Paris Agreement works on this 5-year cycle, and so next year is the big one in Brazil. It's sort of weirdly the pandemic affected it, so now the Brazil will be the next big one. COP30, all the countries have to come with new nationally determined contributions, and those are being put together now. And so some of what will happen at Baku will be a bit of looking at one another, kind of understanding where everyone is and who's going to come in what order. So there's a lot of talk about, this country will go early or they're going to actually submit late and so on. So there's a bit of that around the new NDCs. It does the 5-year cycle and then the midpoint stock take. I mean, there is the odd COP which doesn't have so much of a sort of set purpose in that sense. And so that's why it's up to the host to determine what's looked at, and Azerbaijan have been clear that it's going to be finance, and so I think we are hearing very mixed noises. A lot of people this week saying we're not going to go. There have been logistical things thrown in the way. There's some weird thing going on with hotels, but I think if we can get some breakthroughs on finance, that is critical, because that is the real piece that's missing in all of this. Climate Group works with subnational governments through something called the Under 2 Coalition. So, states in the US or regions like Scotland and Wales in the UK, the Länder in Germany, provinces in other places. It's a sort of level of government where a lot of climate action is implemented, but they're not in the room when the NDCs are set. So it's the nation states that are parties to the agreement. They set it, and then they sort of go home. And in the UK, it might be the Westminster government going home saying, right, Scotland, you're going to have to deliver a bit extra. So one thing that's been great this week is that the UK government have been here in New York. They've been meeting their Welsh and Scottish counterparts and actually having a conversation about how we're going to do this. And so Climate Group have been working with C40, the organisation works with cities, on something called CHAMP. We love an acronym in climate. So Coalition for High Ambition, Multi-Level Partnerships. Basically, it means national governments agreeing with their subnational counterparts that they will work together on the NDCs. And so this week, because they met in New York and sort of chatted it through, the UK government have agreed to join. And I'm mentioning that because that's the sort of thing that's coming at these COPs now is, again, we're in the implementation phase of climate action, and you're seeing that sort of local level turn up. And now we need, within that finance story, we need to understand how finance flows make it also down to those other players, and typically they were called the non-state actors, but it's those other governments.
Will you be going to COP29 yourself?
I will, and not just, I keep telling people this, I had a great night out in Baku in 2000, and so maybe I'm trying to relive the dream, but I'll be going for, I think I've got it down to 5 nights or something in the first week, and when it's one of those COPs as well, we don't send a big group, so I end up with more to do because I've got to cover everyone else's job as well, but I'll be there.
Oh, well, it would be great to see you there then. If you are there and you've got time to talk to us, it would be really interesting to hear about your perceptions of the COP and how it's playing out.
Great. We'll check back in then.
That would be fantastic. For now, though, thank you very much indeed, Helen Clarkson.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much.
As well as all the events led by businesses, NGOs and universities at Climate Week, there are also government meetings around the UN General Assembly, which was also going on in New York last week. To get a sense of the US government's agenda for energy at those meetings, I spoke to Jeffrey Pyatt, who's the Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources. Assistant Secretary Pyatt, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Ed, for having me.
Probably worth briefly at the beginning just getting you to talk a little bit about your role. So you work at the Department of State, focused, as we've been saying, on energy resources. What does that job entail? What are your responsibilities?
So I'm the State Department's chief energy diplomat. What that means is working to support Secretary Blinken and the Biden administration as we seek to leverage America's energy leadership, America's energy abundance, in order to advance the security of our allies and partners around the world. Thinking about both traditional energy and the huge transition that's occurred in terms of America's role in the traditional energy supply chain, something I was reminded about last week when I was at Gas Tech in Houston.
Right.
And I got to listen to former President Bush talking about how different the energy world looked in his presidency when we got 70% of our energy supplies from the Gulf. But then also all the work that the Biden administration has been leading around the world in the context of energy transition and the climate crisis, how we work with allies and partners on issues around clean energy supply chains, and trying to make sure that the United States' position in this new energy era is just as vital as it has been for the 100 years of the past that were dominated by fossil energy.
Right, that's a really interesting point and something I definitely want to dig into in a moment. Before we do, let's just talk a little bit about Climate Week. So here in New York, just before we started recording, you were telling me about the packed agenda you've got while you're here. What are you trying to achieve really at Climate Week?
So 3 things very high on my agenda. First is our support for Ukraine and Ukraine's energy security. I started out my day supporting Secretary of State Blinken's chairmanship of another meeting of the G7 plus ministerial group focused on energy, joined by the Ukrainian foreign minister, but also a lot of other representatives from around the world, all of whom are worried about the energy aspect of the war in Ukraine, how we make sure, as High Representative Borrell put it, that General Winter it does not become part of Putin's military strategy. So that's a thread that's running through all of my engagements this week. Second is all the work that we're doing to really highlight my team's leadership on issues around critical minerals. So we have a remarkable number of events this week which focus on clean energy supply chains, but with a particular focus on the minerals, cobalt, lithium, nickel, zinc, copper, rare earths, of which we need vastly increased volumes in order to meet our energy transition goals, and where we're working as hard as we can to make sure that we don't trade an era of European dependence on Russian fossil energy for an era of collective vulnerability to Chinese weaponization of its energy minerals. And then third is a lot of conversation around climate, around energy transition policies, areas like methane abatement, all looking ahead to COP29 in Baku in a couple of weeks. It'll be my 3rd COP in this role, but one that's particularly important in the context of consolidating the significant progress last year at COP28, and the 3rd COP in a row, or 4th, I guess, to be hosted by a fossil energy producer. So a particular burden on all of us, including the United States, who are major producers of fossil energy, to keep pushing the conversation about how we reduce the carbon intensity of those products, even as the world works through the transition, recognizing that we're going to be using a lot of fossil energy for decades to come, and we want to be really focusing as hard as we can on issues like methane, fugitive gases, all the opportunities that we have because of new technology to do a much better job of ameliorating the most damaging effects of those products.
So let's just talk about Ukraine a little bit first then. In terms of what the US and other G7 countries can do to support energy security in Ukraine, which obviously is very vulnerable. It's been a target for Russian attacks. Ukrainian energy infrastructure has been clearly one of the priorities for targeting by Russian forces. What can you do as the international community to help support energy security and try and keep the lights on, keep people warm in their homes?
The first and most important thing is to support the Ukrainians, who have demonstrated extraordinary resilience and fortitude throughout this war, but especially in the energy space. And it's hard to overestimate how important it is that Ukrainian energy workers have been able to keep the lights on, even in the face of having lost, at this point, close to 80% of their thermal power capacity, a third of hydropower capacity, their largest nuclear facility under illegal Russian occupation, and almost daily barrages of Iranian-sourced drones, North Korean missiles, all of which are being used by Putin in order to try to achieve, by attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure, what he's failed to achieve on the battlefield, which is to break the will of the Ukrainians to resist. So we've been working on this effort for nearly 2 years now, under the G7 Plus framework, having mobilized literally billions of dollars of assistance from across the international community, but also trying to find auto transformers and gas turbines and cable and switch gear and all the stuff that you need to repair the damage that Putin has inflicted, but also working with the Ukrainians on passive protection, so hardening of their facilities. Who imagined that we would have to think about designs for concrete enclosures for transformer stations, for instance. But also helping the Ukrainians to lean into the work that they're already doing on efficiency. And I come to these issues, and I was asked to lead on this soon after becoming Assistant Secretary, because I also lived in Ukraine for 3 winters as U.S. Ambassador. And I've seen the sort of evolution of their energy story, decoupling completely and successfully from Russian energy supplies, but also a profound determination among the Ukrainians to build a future energy system that is cleaner, greener, decentralized, fully aligned with Ukraine's future membership in the European Union.
How difficult is it to get that equipment, first of all, just to source it and then to get it into Ukraine, as you say, the turbines, the transformers, switchgear and everything? There's a lot of talk in the industry right now about equipment shortages, a lot of constraints in the supply chain. People talk about projects in the United States not being able to find the right equipment that they need. Does that make it particularly difficult to find those right supplies that Ukraine needs?
So I would say, first of all, I think sourcing is harder than transport at this point, first order. I've been intensively engaged just in recent weeks, CEOs at GE Vernova, at Siemens, Solar Turbine CEO. In fact, later today I will be part of a roundtable which President Zelensky is hosting with some of our leading energy company CEOs to talk about some of these issues. Bloomberg had a good piece on it this morning. So that's part of the challenge. Part of the challenge also is that Russia's tactics have shifted. So the first target of the Russian energy war, well, the very first target of Russia's energy war was gas resources. And I was ambassador in Ukraine when the Kremlin first started pulling back on gas supplies. Ukraine managed its way through that challenge. Then after the full-scale invasion began in 2022, you saw a systematic effort to dismantle Ukraine's national transmission grid. One consequence of that, as my boss, Secretary Blinken, points out, is we've all become much more expert on 750 kVA auto transformers and where they come from and how long they take to procure. And USAID has put hundreds of millions of dollars into this line of effort. We have built a large number of auto transformers and grid equipment. We have worked with colleagues around the world. The European Union has created a whole new mechanism through the Ukraine Energy Support Fund, managed by the energy community, in order to source these materials, both new build, but also I was listening today, for instance, to several of the Baltic foreign ministers talking about how they literally were dismantling power plants, old thermal power plants, and packing them up and shipping them to Ukraine to help destroy or rebuild what Putin has destroyed. Same with transmission equipment. But ultimately, long term, the solution is that Russia is brought to heel, that there is a ceasefire, and B, that Ukraine puts in place the reforms, the market changes necessary to attract the billions of dollars that it's going to take to build a future energy system fully integrated with ENTSO-E and the European system.
Right. Now let's talk about critical minerals. I think you really put your finger on it earlier in what you were saying about the position of the United States. You know, the US is a fossil fuel superpower, world's largest oil producer, world's largest gas producer, world's largest exporter of LNG, and it's very clearly not in that position in low carbon energy. China is a dominant player in batteries, EVs, solar modules, up the supply chain into silicon, battery raw materials, everything upstream of that, a lot of the key metals as well. And so you'll hear people say that for that reason, the energy transition is absolutely not in the US national interest in terms of national security. That, as you say, you're kind of swapping a very strong position in fossil fuels for a potentially much weaker position in low carbon energy. How do you address that?
So I think it's like the old car rental ad used to say, you know, we're Avis, we try harder. In this case, the United States and frankly the collective West, we're late to this game because China has spent 15, 20 years hoovering up resources around the world, acquiring mines, building a regime of subsidies and capacity that has given it a dominant position. But I would not be as pessimistic as your remarks imply. First of all, we have a huge leg up now because of the Inflation Reduction Act and the stimulus that has provided to massive new investments and job creation here in the United States, but also the replication effect that you're starting to see in India, in Japan, in the European Union. Everybody is trying to figure out. Everybody recognizes that these are the industries of the future, whether we're talking about electric vehicles, clean energy generation, transmission, battery storage, and everybody wants to be part of that new industry. The good news is we're still in relatively early innings in terms of this energy transition and the evolution thereof. I mentioned I was at an event earlier today as part of our mineral security partnership, a coalition of 14 governments plus the European Union, representing more than 50% of global GDP, all dedicated to attacking two problems. How do we deliver vastly increased volumes of these materials that we're going to need in order to meet our energy transition targets? And how do we do so in a way that ensures that the benefits are also shared by the producer countries, many of which happen to be in the developing world? So the United States is coming to this contest with a sense of confidence in our own laboratories, our own investors, our own companies, but also with an understanding that this is a generational opportunity for a lot of the producer countries. And those producer countries are not interested in a business model that is characterized by poor environmental standards, child labor, and the naked extraction of raw minerals, which are then exported to China for processing and value addition. So we're trying to build a different paradigm, or as my boss, Secretary Blinken, likes to say, to make a better offer. And I've been impressed. This Climate Week is particularly important. I made the point earlier today. I don't think ever in the history of New York has there been 1 week with as many different mining and critical minerals focused events as are unfolding here over the next couple of days. Between the event that we had today with SAFE and our partners there, a meeting of the MSP partners, a meeting of the MSP Forum, which is the group which was stimulated by the European Union, but it brings together the MSP partners and other producer countries that are interested in talking to us. And then literally probably a half dozen other events scattered across Climate Week focused on clean energy supply chains, mines of the future. How do we solve for these two challenges that I talked about?
How hard is that going to be to solve those two challenges? It feels like when you look at the lead that China has established and the significant advantages that China has in a lot of those supply chains, and as you say, the money, the subsidies that China's prepared to put in, and the way that China has established these industries as clear strategic priorities for its industrial strategy and for its foreign policy, seems pretty daunting to change that, doesn't it? To shift China or to build an alternative infrastructure. Do you really think it can be done?
I think so, and I think there are two reasons for that. One is what exists here in Manhattan. There is no place in the world which is more efficient at mobilizing capital against innovation and market opportunities created by that innovation. So grabbing onto the U.S. innovation ecosystem, and again, this was a big part of our conversations with SAFE. And the other is, I think that in many of the producer countries, there is a high degree of fatigue with the business model that China has traditionally deployed, which sees a lot of Chinese labor, very lax attention to ESG standards, and a fairly consistent pattern of extraction of raw materials, which are then shipped off to China for processing. I think we're in the early stages of this process. It's like looking at the Wright brothers and trying to imagine a 777 and nonstop flights from New York to Singapore. The world just looks so different today, and I think energy transition is going to see the same kind of quantum leaps in technology and application, and it's way too early to say that the race has been run.
Do you think there's a fundamental problem with the way markets work in some of these areas that militates against the investment needed for long-term supply? Well, I mean, think about lithium just as an example, which went up like a rocket and then down like a stick. It seems to be very hard for private sector companies and investors to know that they're going to be able to make consistent returns in some of these things.
So I'll just say I had the opportunity, another one of my meetings today was with the CEO of a very large publicly traded mining company. And he was very clear that they're committed to lithium in the long term. And prices go up and prices go down. That's the nature of commodity industries. But this is also an industry where you can have a 10-year spread between first prospect and first product. And we're trying to shorten that time frame. But and part of what MSP is designed to do is to mobilize our collective demand, but also our collective resources. So institutions like Exim and Development Finance Corporation in the US, JOGMEC, JBIC in Japan, we all have the same objective, and we frankly all have exactly the same concern about the single dominant market player.
Final thought, wanted to look ahead to COP29. You're saying, as you say, that's one of the things you're talking about here is looking ahead to that meeting in Azerbaijan in November. I feel like I'm hearing quite a lot of sort of ambient noise, playing down expectations, discussions, talk that the negotiations are going to be very difficult. The new collective quantified goal for climate finance is meant to be a priority there. Doesn't seem to be an enormous amount of progress being made on that at the moment. What are your expectations for COP29, and what would success there look like to you?
So I will say this will be my third COP. The Emiratis deserve enormous credit for what they accomplished last year. It was also enormous and sprawling and fused a number of events. There was the sort of UN climate negotiations, which look a lot like the debates that happen every day here in Turtle Bay. There was the high-level summitry, and there was a very significant role for the private sector and sort of a big international trade show. Importantly, everybody starting from the premise that they were there to show off what they're doing on energy transition. And I think that's one of the things that makes me hopeful. I think there's been a paradigm shift in the conversation. And one of the things that's been most encouraging and empowering to me in this job, and I'm not one of these people who keeps a checklist of every country I've been to or how many miles I've racked up, but my wife would tell you it's a lot. And I've never had a meeting with an energy minister or foreign minister or prime minister around the world who says, this climate thing is just a hoax. We don't need to worry about it. The world recognizes that this is a fundamental challenge of our time. They're looking to the United States for leadership. They're looking to American companies. I've also never had a single leader say to me anything other than, how do I get more American investors in my country? And that makes me hugely proud of the leadership that the Biden administration has set out, but also optimistic about how we can continue to do what we do best, which is leverage the openness of our economy, the innovation that is a characteristic of the U.S. system, and our determination to build the broadest coalition possible.
So you think there will be further progress at COP29?
There has to be. That's the need of the moment. I have no illusions. The timing is complicated vis-a-vis our domestic politics. We'll have to see what happens after that. But the whole world agrees that we have to tackle this problem. We have to do it holistically. We have to attack all the different challenges that I talked about earlier. We have to figure out how to accelerate the deployment of clean and sustainable energy. We have to figure out how we decarbonize our traditional energy production. But there's remarkably broad agreement on all of those principles. There's also a very clear understanding, certainly for the Biden administration, that our approach will not be credible if we don't meet the developing world where it is. By that I mean we have to recognize, and I just had a very successful energy dialogue last week or maybe the week before with Nigeria. A big part of that conversation was understanding that Nigeria, on its way to becoming fifth largest country in the world, huge fossil energy resources, growing population, enormous demographic pressure, that the fundamental challenge that a country like Nigeria faces is energy access. We as the United States have an interest in helping the Nigerian government, President Tinubu in this case, to meet that energy requirement in the most sustainable possible way. But it's going to be, by definition, an all-of-the-above approach.
Certainly going to be fascinating to watch. We'll be there as the Energy Gang reporting on everything that happens at COP29. For now, though, Assistant Secretary Pyatt, thank you very much indeed. Great talking to you.
Thanks so much, and we'll see you in Baku.
Absolutely. See you there. So, that's all for us from Climate Week 2024. We'll be carrying on the climate conversation very soon at COP29 in Azerbaijan in November. The Energy Gang will be there to cover all the key developments, so subscribe now if you want to hear that. Until then, goodbye.